Good evening. Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad you're here. My name is Abby Glogauer. I am the curator of Jewish collections at the Filson Historical Society. Thank you for joining us for tonight's program. I want to thank you again for joining us for A Better Life for Their Children, a Rosenwald School's journey. I'd like to remind everyone to please silence your cell phones. You can do it right now for the duration of the program. For our in-person attendees, we have a microphone, actually two, at the front of the room for your use during the question and answer session after the talk. And we really do want you to use the microphones because we have folks joining us via Zoom, so they need to hear your voice in there too. If you are joining virtually, please ask your questions in the chat and our moderator will share them as time permits. And of course, Mr. Andrew Feiler will be signing books and continuing the conversation after we conclude. And with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Andrew Feiler is a photographer and author and fifth-generation Georgian. Having grown up Jewish in Savannah, he has been shaped by the rich complexities of the American South. Feiler has long been active in civic life. He has helped create over a dozen community initiatives, serves on multiple not-for-profit boards, and is an active advisor to numerous elected officials and political candidates. His art is an extension of his civic values. Feiler was named Book Photographer of the Year by Prix de la Photographie Paris in 2022, and A Better Life for Their Children won the gold medal for a documentary book. The book also won the International Photography Awards 2022 first place for documentary book. It has been honored with an Eric Hoffer Award, an Axiom Award Gold Medal, and a Book, Jacket, and Journal Award from the Association of University Presses. Photolucida named Feiler's Rosenwald School Images a 2020 Top 50 portfolio, and Photoville selected them for the 2020 edition of The Fence, an outdoor exhibition displayed internationally in 11 cities. The solo exhibition of his work is on tour now. Feiler's photographs have been instrumental in the campaign to create a new U.S. National Historic Park and inspired the composition of a symphony. His work has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Smithsonian, L'Oeil de la Photographie, Architect, The Forward, as well as on CBS This Morning and NPR. His prints have been displayed in galleries and museums, including solo exhibitions at such venues as the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta, and the International Civil Rights Center and Museum in Greensboro, North Carolina. His photographs are in public and private collections, including that of the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of African American History and Culture. We are so honored. Please join me in welcoming Andrew Feiler.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for coming out on a Friday night. It's easy to spot the history nerds in this room. That would be all of us. It is great to be here. It is great for this work to be in Louisville and at the Filson. This exhibition originated in 2021 at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta. It's been traveling around. It came here from the Tennessee State Museum in Nashville, and next goes to the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience in New Orleans, which only opened 2 years ago. And it's currently booked through the middle of 2025. So, and hopefully beyond that. So it's great to be able to share all of this with you. I'm going to start with two premises. For those of you who were here at my at the talk we did with the Brinkley brothers, these alumni of Rosenwald schools, I'm going to open at the same point, but then I'm going to have the luxury of time today and be able to get into a lot more stories about my own Rosenwald Schools journey. But I'm going to start with two premises. The Rosenwald Schools program is one of the most transformative developments in the first half of the 20th century in America. It dramatically reshapes the African-American experience. It dramatically reshapes the American experience, and yet it remains hidden history, and its scope and sweep is largely unknown. Secondly, the collaboration between Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington is one of the earliest collaborations between Blacks and Jews in the cause that only later becomes known as civil rights. And there is a direct connection between the collaboration of Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington, their friendship, and the relationship between Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and Dr. King, who famously says that when he marched with Dr. King, it felt like his feet were praying. And what happened in Georgia just 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago now, and this is not a political statement, this is a historical statement. Filmmaker John Ossoff and Reverend Raphael Warnock crisscrossed the state of Georgia together in a runoff election, developing not just a political alliance, but close personal friendship. And Georgia sends its first African-American and first Jewish American to the United States Senate. That relationship between John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock stands on the shoulders of the relationship of Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington. So with that as sort of some context, did I get this on there we go. I'm going to start with a photograph of a photograph. This is a portrait of Julius Rosenwald that hangs on the wall of the Noble Hill School in Bartow County, Georgia. Julius Rosenwald is born to Jewish immigrants who had fled religious persecution in Germany. He grows up in Springfield, Illinois, across the street from Abraham Lincoln's home. If you go to downtown Springfield today, you will find this 4-square block Lincoln Home National Historical Site, where all of the historic homes in this 4-block area have been preserved. And directly across the street from Abraham Lincoln's home is Julius Rosenwald's childhood home. Peter Ascoli told me the story that when he's the principal biographer of Julius Rosenwald, and when he was researching the biography, he went down there and he was meeting with the superintendent of this National Historical Site. And he said, "Do you happen to know where Julius Rosenwald's childhood home was?" And the superintendent says, "You're sitting in it. It's the offices of the superintendent." Now, back then, there was not a plaque in front of this home. Now there's a plaque. And that plaque was placed there by the campaign to create a Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald Schools National Historical Park. And the vision of this campaign is it would have a visitor center in Chicago and then Rosenwald schools in each of the 15 Rosenwald school states. Legislation actually, so and I'm on the advisory board of the campaign, full disclosure. There's a woman named Dorothy Cantor who came up with this idea only in 2016. Dorothy is a force of nature. At the end of 2020, legislation cleared Congress requiring the Secretary of the Interior to do the requisite feasibility study, and that study is now underway. When this happens, and it will happen, this will be the first component of the U.S. National Park system to honor a Jewish American. So Julius Rosenwald rises to become president of Sears, Roebuck Company. They didn't have the term CEO back then. And with innovations like satisfaction guaranteed or your money back, he turns Sears into the world's largest retailer of its era. And he becomes one of the earliest and greatest philanthropists in American history. And his cause is what later becomes known as civil rights. And he is motivated by his Judaism. He sees America as a safe haven from anti-Semitism, and he sees that safe haven weakened by how America treats her African-American citizens. And he says, "I believe in America, but I do not see how America can go forward if part of her people are left behind. This is a portrait of Booker T. Washington that hangs above the mantle in the president's home at what is now Tuskegee University. Booker T. Washington, born into slavery in Virginia, attends Hampton College, becomes an educator, and is the founding principal of the historically Black college in Tuskegee, Alabama, originally known as Tuskegee Institute. Now, this is a rare photograph of the two men together, printed on fabric and sewn into a quilt to commemorate the restoration of the Pine Grove School in Richland County, South Carolina. And at the rededication ceremony, former students, former teachers, and their descendants were invited to sign the quilt. And it hangs today in the restored schoolhouse. In fact, the image on the cover of my book is the restored classroom inside the Pine Grove School. And in the back left-hand corner, you can see this quilt hanging. Now, these two men meet for the first time in 1911, May 18th, 1911, just over 110 years ago. You have to remember, 1911 is before the Great Migration, which doesn't begin until later that decade. So 90% of African Americans live in the South, and public schools for African Americans are mostly shacks, with a fraction of the funding provided for the education of white children. Many jurisdictions do not even have public schools for African Americans. And so in 1912, these two men create the program that becomes known as Rosenwald schools. This is a portrait from the Filson archives of students and teachers out in front of the Jefferson Jacob School. The tour tomorrow, for those of you who will be on the tour, will stop at the Jefferson Jacob School. They reach out to Black communities just like this. And they say, if you will contribute to a school, and we will count as your contribution cash, land, material, or labor. And if you will reach out to the school board, the white school board, because we want to be deliberate about creating Black-white dialogue as a foundation for future progress, and these have to be public schools. While we welcome the school system's contribution, at a minimum, they have to agree to own, maintain, and staff the school, pay for the teachers. If you do those two things, Julius Rosenwald will make a substantial contribution towards school construction. Now, think about this. The Black community has to contribute. This is one of the earliest examples of challenge grants in philanthropic history. The white school system has to participate. This is an early example of public-private partnership. And from 1912, when the Lochapoka community in Lee County, Alabama, is the first community to raise the match for what becomes the very first Rosenwald School, until 1937, when President Roosevelt presides over the dedication of the Eleanor Roosevelt School in Meriwether County, Georgia, that's Warm Springs. The program builds 4,978 schools across 15 states, and the results are transformative. Now, before I talk about transformation, let me tell you a couple of things about this schoolhouse. So first of all, my process is very research intensive, and I read and shoot and shoot and read, and the reading informs the shooting, and the shooting informs the reading. There are 100 Rosenwald schools listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Each of those come with an extensive National Register nomination form. My wife and I actually live in an old industrial building in Atlanta that we refurbished that happens to have, the protagonist in this story happens to have played a major role in overturning the convict leasing system in the state of Georgia. As I'm fond of saying, if you scratch the surface in the South, you're not sure whether you're going to be dealt a saint or a sinner. More likely, you'll be dealt a sinner. We happen to have been dealt a saint. But I've written one of these National Register nomination forms. I know how powerful they are, how informative they are. So I've read 50 of these National Register nomination forms. And the story I'm about to tell you comes from the nomination form of the Eleanor Roosevelt School. In 1929, Franklin Roosevelt, not yet president, sees a Rosenwald School in Meriwether County. And he says, we need more Rosenwald schools in Meriwether County. So he calls up the Rosenwald Fund and he says, we need more Rosenwald schools in Meriwether County. Well, it's 1929. The recession has set in. The school system is unable to contribute. The Black community is unable to raise its contribution. And so the idea languishes. In 1937, President Roosevelt calls up Edwin Embry, who's running the Rosenwald Fund, and he says, okay, I'm ready for my school. Well, the program had actually formally ended in 1932. Julius Rosenwald died in 1932. And 4,977 of these schools were built from 1912 to 1932, 20 years. This is 5 years later. And Edwin Embry says to President Roosevelt, well, Mr. President, the program formally ended 5 years ago. But for you, Mr. President, and they make an exception, and this becomes the last Rosenwald school. The Black community contributes, the school system contributes, the WPA contributes. And the head of the WPA is in the Oval Office reporting to President Roosevelt, who asks about this schoolhouse. And he tells President Roosevelt that they are $1,000 short. And in the Oval Office, President Roosevelt pulls out his checkbook and writes the $1,000 check that closes the gap. And later in 1937, he presides over the dedication of this schoolhouse. Now, the schoolhouse closes in 1972 and was sold to a family in the cabinet business who bricked up the windows because they used it for storage. When I was out about shooting this work, it was for sale. And I'm pleased to report that courtesy of the work of the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation, this building has been acquired with conservation easements attached to it, and a brother and sister team are now working to restore the schoolhouse and turn it into both a community center and museum. So I said the results were transformative. There are two economists from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago who have done 5 studies of Rosenwald schools. And what their data shows is that prior to World War I, there was a large and persistent Black-white education gap in the South. That gap closes precipitously between World War I and World War II. And the single largest driver of that achievement, and it is an achievement, is Rosenwald schools. In addition, many of the leaders and foot soldiers of the civil rights movement to come through these schools. Medgar Evers, Maya Angelou, multiple members of the Little Rock Nine, and Congressman John Lewis all went to Rosenwald schools. Now, I grew up in Savannah, Georgia. I left the South after high school and went bouncing around the world for 15 years. Never thought I would come back to the South. I decided that the South had grown up in my absence. It was okay to come back. And I moved back to Atlanta in 1995. And for 25 years, I was a constituent of Congressman Lewis's. And so I reached out to Congressman Lewis and asked if he would do the introduction to this book. And he said, you know, I'm not sure I'm comfortable writing the history of Rosenwald schools. I just know I went to school there. I said, Congressman, I will have an essay in this book, and there will be 3 other essays, 3 other essays by prominent African-American preservationists. I think we'll have the history covered. What I want you to do is what only you can do. Bring us into that classroom. What was it like to go to school there? What was your day like? What did you study? And what role did education play in your life? And he said, oh, I can do that. So it was on October 29th, 2019. I found myself in Congressman Lewis's Washington office, sitting around the round table in the center of this space. I will add that his staff had said to me, can we do this in the Atlanta office? And somewhat boldly, I said no. And the reason for that is, and I want to talk a little bit, you're going to see some other portraits here. I'm going to talk about the language of my portraiture. Number one, the location is important because it's part of the story and part of the image. And I wanted this shot in the Washington office because it was a statement of power and a statement of achievement. In addition, I never told anybody what to wear because I wanted them to be authentic. And I never told them what expression to put on their faces because I wanted them to have agency in how they helped me tell their connection to this story. So it's October 29th of 2019. We've been sitting in this round table in the middle of his space working on the introduction. At the end, he takes his hand and he slaps it down on the table and he says, "It's perfect. Don't change a word." And he gets up and this jacket has been drooped on the chair that he'd been sitting in, and he puts it on and he's got this cancer awareness ribbon on his lapel. And he says, "Should I take the ribbon off?" I said, "Congressman Lewis, I want the authentic you, and that is the authentic you. Leave it on." It was exactly 60 days later, on December 29th of 2019, that Congressman Lewis went public with a pancreatic cancer diagnosis that would take his life the next year. I didn't set out to have this kind of extraordinary one-on-one experience with one of the great members of the United States Congress in our lifetime, but what an extraordinary gift this experience was that this project was able to make happen. So this is the Emory School in Hale County, Alabama, the oldest known surviving Rosenwald school from about 1915. And we say about because in the first couple of years of the program, they didn't keep exact records as to years. And it's also one of the only, as far as I know, the only known surviving example of one of the original two designs for Rosenwald schools. And I want to talk about the architecture, and I'm going to take you inside. You're going to see some, those of us on the tour tomorrow are going to see some of these features of the Rosenwald schools that we'll visit. But to talk about the architecture, I have to tell you the story of Robert Robinson Taylor. Robert Robinson Taylor was the first African-American to attend MIT, the first accredited African-American architect. He is hired by Booker T. Washington to be the chief architect at Tuskegee. If you go to Tuskegee today, which in itself is a National Historical Site, many of the beautiful buildings on that campus were designed by Robert Robinson Taylor. Robert Robinson Taylor also happens to be the great-grandfather of Valerie Jarrett, long a fixture in public policy circles in Chicago, and a principal advisor to President Obama during his entire tenure in the White House. Robert Robinson Taylor leads the team of architects at Tuskegee that lay out the architectural principles of the Rosenwald schools. And these principles persist throughout the entire program. Large windows, these banks of 9/9 pane windows on the left to let in lots of light, because originally these schoolhouses would not have had electricity. On the right, cloakrooms so that dirty outer garments could be kept out of the education spaces. The education spaces could be kept cleaner. Brick chimneys that vented the potbelly stoves that kept the schoolhouse warm on colder nights. And then you see 2/3 of the way back toward the back of this space, a room divider. That room divider would originally had in it a series of doors that could be closed off to separate these two education spaces, or accordioned back to create a unified space to be used as a community center outside of education hours. This is progressive era architecture in service to education, and these basic principles persist throughout the entire program. Now, that was what was known as a one-teacher school. This is a two-teacher school, the Hope School in Newberry County, South Carolina. James Hope was the state school superintendent in South Carolina, who was so committed to the Rosenwald Schools program that every county in South Carolina had Rosenwald schools. In the case of this schoolhouse, his family all but donated. They actually sold for $5, which back in 1926 was still basically a donation. They sold for $5 the 2 acres of land for this schoolhouse, and in appreciation, the community named the school after the Hope family. The schoolhouse closes in 1954, and Ron Hope, who's the great nephew of James Hope, who was a career Army officer, retired back to Newberry County, South Carolina. He says, I'm on a pension from the people of the United States. What can I do to give back more? And he decides to take it upon himself to single-handedly restore this schoolhouse. If you go today to the National Museum of African American History and Culture on the National Mall, you will find from this schoolhouse 6 school desks, 1 potbelly stove, and the original sign proclaiming Hope School. Now, this is a 2-teacher school. This is a 3-teacher school, the Pleasant Plains School in Hartford County, North Carolina. Now, the architectural idiom of the Rosenwald schools was that they were to be modest. That was in part to save cost, but in part also not to attract the ire, otherwise known as arson, from the local white citizenry. But there was a more specific dictate. There was an architecture professor from the named Fletcher Dressler from the Peabody School in Nashville, which is now part of Vanderbilt, who in 1919 and 1920 undertook an evaluation of the architecture of the Rosenwald schools. And Fletcher Dressler believed that a cupola was derivative of church architecture. That little thing on top is a cupola. And on a public building, it violated separation of church and state. So they decreed that there shall be no cupolas, what I call the no doodads rule. But this schoolhouse has a cupola. Now remember, the Black community has to contribute, and they count cash, land, material, or labor. This community wanted a cupola, and they built a cupola. This is African American Community Agency in 1920 Jim Crow, North Carolina. I went to of the 4,978 schools, only 500 survive. Only half of those have been restored. I went to 105 of the surviving schools. 3 of them have cupolas. One of the others that has a cupola is the Jefferson Jacobs School that we're visiting tomorrow. And Leslie, can you stand up, Leslie? Leslie Barris led the restoration of this schoolhouse and continues to lead this restoration. And this is one of the only other school that I saw that has a cupola is the school on the campus of Fort Valley State University in Fort Valley, Georgia, about an hour south of Macon. And we actually know that Julius Rosenwald visited that schoolhouse and took pictures of it. So he actually saw a schoolhouse with a cupola. So we've seen this was a 2-teacher school. You've seen 1-teacher schools, 2-teacher schools, 3-teacher schools, these small white clapboard structures. That was the vast majority of the schoolhouses. But by the end of the program, they're building 1, 2, and 3-story red brick buildings. This is the Dunbar School in Pulaski County, Arkansas, otherwise known as Little Rock. Now, I knew that this was an extraordinary story. It wasn't clear from the beginning how you tell it visually. And so I started out shooting this architectural narrative in these exterior images. But when I found out that only half of the surviving 500 schools had been restored, I realized that the adaptive reuse narrative was important because very few of these schools are still in use for educational purposes. In fact, of the 105 schools that I went to, only 5 are still in use for educational purposes. Dunbar is one of them. It's now a magnet middle school. But most of these schools were too small and they outgrew their educational uses long ago. And so to preserve them, they needed to be adaptively reused. And to tell the adaptive reuse narrative, I had to get inside. And to get inside, I needed permission. And that's when I meet all of these extraordinary people, former students, former teachers, preservationists, and I bring their stories into this overarching narrative with portraits. One more thing about this school, and then I'll tell you one other story. Several of the members of the Little Rock Nine, who helped integrate Little Rock Central, which is 1 mile from this schoolhouse, attended the Dunbar School. And if this schoolhouse looks vaguely familiar with its Art Deco architecture, it's because the architect of Little Rock Central was also the architect of the Dunbar School. Now, I had never heard of Rosenwald schools until February of 2015. I had just turned my first photography book into my publisher. It would come out later that year. And I found myself at lunch with a woman named Jeannie Syriac, who had originated the role of African-American Cultural Heritage Specialist at the Georgia State Historic Preservation Office. And the story shocked me. I'm a fifth-generation Jewish Georgian. I have been a civic activist my entire life. The pillars of this story are the pillars of my life. How could I have never heard of Rosenwald schools? So I came home and I Googled them, and I found that while there were a number of history books on the topic, there was not a comprehensive photographic account of the program. And so I set out to do exactly that. And over the next 3.5 years, I drove 25,000 miles across all 15 of the program states and shot 105 of the surviving schools. So these are the Pleasant Hill Quilters. 3 of these women had parents that attended Rosenwald schools. 3 of these women attended Rosenwald schools. And LaJoyce Flanagan, who's in the front row center, was a teacher in this schoolhouse. And this schoolhouse, when it closed, fell into disrepair. And these women came together to restore the schoolhouse. And they sold quilts in order to raise the money to restore the schoolhouse. It now serves as a community center, and these women gather in the schoolhouse on most Mondays to quilt. And I will simply add that we commissioned a quilt from them, which is our bedspread at home. When this exhibition goes to the Bullock Museum in Austin, Texas, which it's doing in late 2024 and early 2025, some of the artifacts from this schoolhouse will be part of the exhibition. This is the Lincoln School in Bledsoe County, Tennessee, now a community center. Notice the pressed tin that decorates all the walls and ceilings. Another extraordinary example of the pride this community had in its schoolhouse, and also African-American agency in deciding that this is what they wanted in their schoolhouse. This is the Denby School in Tidewater, Virginia. Beatrice Combs attended this school. And when the schoolhouse closed, she and her husband purchased the schoolhouse and promptly got into a fight. He wanted to turn it into a bar. She said, "Over my dead body." And so they rent it out. It's a 2-teacher school. They rent it out to 2 families, one in each former classroom. And Beatrice Combs joins an evangelical church that's meeting in a strip mall. And in the words of her daughter, she accepted the Lord, and they eventually rent the schoolhouse out to the church. The church thrives. They add on to it. And the old schoolhouse is now the Beatrice Combs Fellowship Hall with her portrait hanging above the doorway. So I'm going to pause and talk a little bit about how I approached this work. When Jeannie Syriac, the preservationist from whom I first heard about Rosenwald schools, she crisscrossed the state of Georgia, finding Rosenwald schools in these communities without the aid of the internet. She would show up in these communities and she would have names and she would ask people and she would try to find them. And she found 37 surviving Rosenwald schools and collectively listed them on the National Register. Jeannie would scoff at my use of the internet, but I would go online and I would try to find these schools and find the compelling stories. And one of the things that I did is that I would look at where the schoolhouse was, how it was located on the compass. Because as you can imagine, if the schoolhouse faces east, I need to be there in the morning for morning light, or else it's going to be in shadow. If it faces west, I need to be there in the afternoon, unless it's a cloudy day. And I did often deliberately go out at times when I expected a lot of clouds. The other piece of this story is that the schoolhouses have this linearity to their architecture, but the photographic frame is an aspect ratio of 3:2. And the linearity of these schoolhouses doesn't quite fill the frame. So I needed to either have sky or foreground. So the clouds were an important part of filling the top parts of these images. So I had done my research on this schoolhouse, and it faces west. And I'm in Washington, D.C. I've rented a car, and the morning is going to be terrible light. It's going to be completely blue sky. And the clouds are supposed to come in about 2:00 in the afternoon. Well, I've got a dinner in Washington that night, so I've got to be done by 3:30. So I drive down there. I wait for the traffic to go, and I drive down there, and I get down here at about 10:30 in the morning, and there's not a cloud in the sky. The light is horrible. The schoolhouse is totally in shadow. And I sit there across the street from this, has one of those kind of, it's not a highway, but it's a very busy thoroughfare. It's got 3 lanes in both directions. And I sit across from the schoolhouse, and about 1:30, the clouds start to come in. And it's 5 minutes to 2. And I'm like, in 5 minutes, I'm going to shoot this schoolhouse. And a van pulls up and parks right in front of the door to the church. So I get in the car, and I go across 6 lanes of traffic, and I park, and I knock on the door. It's the pastor. And I tell him what I'm doing, and he graciously takes me inside, tells me the story, shows me the Beatrice Combs Fellowship Hall, shows me Beatrice Combs' portrait, and gives me the cell phone number of her daughter. It is from her. And by the way, he agrees to move his car. When this exhibition premiered at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, this photograph is in the exhibition. Beatrice Combs' children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren came down to see the exhibition. They remain members of this church today. This is a portrait of Abraham Lincoln that hangs on the wall of the Warfield School in Montgomery County, Tennessee. There was an old school, a pre-Rosenwald school on this site that in 1922 was destroyed by a tornado. And the person in the community that led the effort to raise the funds to create the match that would enable a Rosenwald school was named Warfield, and the community named the school in his honor. It has now been restored by Montgomery County and turned into this exquisitely beautiful, they did this very tasteful addition that's kind of tucked behind the school, so you don't really see it from the road. It's really beautifully done. And this portrait of Abraham Lincoln hangs on the wall, and you see the shadow of these 9/9 pane windows that are this iconic element in Rosenwald School's architecture. But many of these schools remain unrestored and at risk of collapse. So this is the Hannah School in Newberry County, South Carolina, across the street from the Hannah AME Church, which is the namesake for the schoolhouse. The church's graveyard has grown up around the schoolhouse, and in the kind of detail that you could never make up, the schoolhouse rises on Deadfall Road. But as you see, the schoolhouse is in great distress and at risk of collapse. And these places are the locus of history and memory and story in a community. And when we lose structures like this, we lose a piece of the American soul. And so a very important subcomponent of this entire journey was the historic preservation imperative. And indeed, I came across schoolhouses that had collapsed so recently that they were surrounded by emergency fencing or yellow caution tape. This is the W.E.B. Du Bois School in Wake County, North Carolina, that, unbeknownst to me, had been demolished a week before I got there because it had been deemed unstable and unsafe. And I will add that this, when I pulled up, actually, on top of the Coke machine on the right were 2 buzzards. They left, but the Coke machine stayed. But as I said, the heart and soul of this journey was the people that I met along the way. Some of you were here last month when Frank and Charles Brinkley joined me on stage. For those of you who weren't, I'll simply tell the story. This is the K-Rose School in Sumner County, Tennessee. The portrait of Julius Rosenwald that hangs above this doorway has hung in the schoolhouse since it opened in 1923. Brothers Frank and Charles Brinkley attended this school. They went to college. They went to graduate school. Frank actually went to graduate school twice. one of his degrees is from Tuskegee, and they both became educators. Frank became a high school math and science teacher. Charles became a middle school principal. They have 4 sisters, all of whom went through this school, all of whom went to college. And these 6 siblings have 10 children. All 10 children went to college. That legacy may not have happened without this schoolhouse. This is the Bay Springs School in Forest County, Mississippi. This is outside of Hattiesburg. Vernon Damer Sr., his grandfather, donated the 2 acres of land for this schoolhouse. Vernon Damer attended this school. And when the schoolhouse closed in 1958, Vernon Damer had been smart enough to build in a reversionary clause. So the schoolhouse reverted to Vernon Damer, who turned the schoolhouse into a locus of civil rights activism. SNCC met here, the NAACP met here. And Vernon Damer, who was a farmer and had a sawmill and had a country store, and was also the head of the NAACP in Forest County, when he drove African Americans into Hattiesburg to attempt to register to vote, he had them park behind the schoolhouse so they could not be identified by their vehicles and harassed. Their son Dennis told me that on July 4th, 1964, Freedom Summer, the family threw a picnic for the voter registration volunteers, black and white. Dennis was 11 years old. It was the first time he had seen blacks and whites socialize together. All this activity, as you can imagine, drew the attention and ire of the KKK. Vernon Damer's family home is just behind the trees to the right of the schoolhouse. And on the night of January 10th, 1966, Vernon Damer's home was firebombed by the KKK. And Vernon Damer stood in the front window of his home with a gun trying to hold the attackers off while his wife Ellie got their children out the back door. And Vernon Damer died as a result of his injuries in that fire. This is Ellie Damer inside the Bay Springs School. Ellie Damer grew up in Mississippi, went to a different Rosenwald school, went to college, came back and taught in this schoolhouse. And when the schoolhouse closed in 1958, because the state of Mississippi built a brand new, larger, consolidated, segregated school, do the math, the state of Mississippi is building new, segregated schools 4 years after Brown v. Board. Ellie Damer was denied employment at the new consolidated school because of her husband's activism, and she had to get a job in a school district 35 miles away, and she taught there for the next 21 years. This is the last story I'll share with you tonight. This is the Hopewell School in Bastrop County, Texas. At the time I was there, it was just at the final stages of being renovated and turned into a community center and museum. I was just there last November for to celebrate the 100th anniversary of this schoolhouse. And I will add, the ceremonies were at the Bastrop Opera House. I have made my operatic debut. So this is inside the schoolhouse. This is Elroy and Sophia Williams holding up this photograph, and the photograph in the middle of this image is from the 19th century. That is Sophia and Martin McDonald. They were both born into slavery. And upon emancipation, they started raising farm animals. They acquired some land. They acquired some more land. They eventually acquired 1,200 acres. And when the Rosenwald Schools program came to Bastrop County, Texas in 1919, the family donated 2 acres of land for the school. Its first teacher was their daughter. One of her first students was her daughter, Sophia Williams, shown here on the right, holding up this portrait of her grandparents. Her husband, Elroy Williams, went to a different Rosenwald school in Bastrop County. They both went off to college, came back, and had entire careers as educators in Bastrop County. I found this time and time again, former students becoming educators, becoming the keepers of history and memory and preservation in the community. They have led the restoration of this schoolhouse. And it's why I felt compelled to end up, this is in photographic terms, this project is what's called a hybrid body of work. It's not just images, it's images and stories. There's a story that goes with every image, or in some cases, pairs of images, because I found Rosenwald schools directly connected to the Trail of Tears, to the Tuskegee syphilis study, to Tuskegee Airmen, to embezzlement, to murder. And so I felt compelled to write a short story about each of these schoolhouses. So I hope you'll spend time with these stories. I hope you'll spend time with the images in the exhibition. There's the book, which we'll be signing afterwards. I want to close on a personal note. Oh, sorry, I forgot one more story. Then I'll close. This is a book about Rosenwald schools, but there is another component of Julius Rosenwald's legacy that is simply too important to leave out of this project, and that's the Rosenwald Fellowships. Edwin Embry was so Edwin Embry is, you all know the story of Berea College here. Edwin Embry's grandfather was the founder of Berea College. Edwin Embry was the vice president of the Rockefeller Foundation, and Julius Rosenwald was on the board of the foundation. And he, as he got older, decided he needed to professionalize the work of the Rosenwald Fund. And in 1928, he hires Edwin Embry to run the Rosenwald Fund. And he runs it from 1928 until 1948, when Julius Rosenwald had mandated that all the funds would be spent within 25 years of his death. It's one of the reasons his name is less well known than some of his philanthropic peers like Carnegie and Ford and Rockefeller, whose names survive on the doors of their foundations. All the money is spent out in 15 years, and the Rosenwald Fund shuts down in 1948. Edwin Embry with Julius Rosenwald, comes up with this idea for what becomes the Rosenwald Fellowships. From 1928 to 1948, they give 287 fellowships to white liberal Southerners, folks like newspaper editor Ralph McGill, playwright Lillian Smith. But 587 fellowships go to the leading minds of African-American science, industry, culture, these African-American creatives and intellectuals. It is a who's who of African-American, it's the largest source of philanthropic support for African-American intellectuals and creatives in the 20th century. Folks like Langston Hughes, James Weldon Johnson, Zora Neale Hurston, Marian Anderson. I can go on and on. Gordon Parks was the first photographer to be awarded a Rosenwald grant. And I knew this story, and Gordon Parks was one of the most powerful influences in my own photographic life, because it was through Gordon Parks that I learned that art can be a form of activism. And I had the great privilege of spending some time with Gordon Parks in 1993, when he was on book tour for his memoir, Voices in the Mirror. Roll forward to my time in Atlanta, Georgia, and his daughter, Leslie, is a friend. And I reached out to Leslie and I said, I've got this idea, Leslie, of bringing your father's story into the ability to tell the story of the Rosenwald Fellows. And I've got this idea of you hugging a photograph by your dad. And she says, this is a great idea. And she puts me in touch with the Gordon Parks Foundation, that immediately emails me this self-portrait from Gordon Parks. And he said, this self-portrait was part of Gordon Parks's application to the Rosenwald Fund. I'm like, that will do. But there's more. Gordon Parks, when he applies to the Rosenwald Fund, is a fashion and portrait photographer on the south side of Chicago. It is the Rosenwald Fund that places Gordon Parks with Roy Stryker's photographic unit at the Farm Security Administration. This is one of the most important groups of photographers and one of the most important moments in documentary photography and the history of photography. Roy Stryker runs this unit in the Farm Security Administration, documenting the recovery from the Great Depression. And his photographers are some of the most famous photographers of the 20th century: Carl Meidens, Walker Evans, Dorothea Lange. And he hires Gordon Parks. And he says to Gordon Parks on his first day, go down to this department store in downtown Washington, D.C. and buy a coat. Gordon Parks goes down. He asks to try on a coat. He's physically thrown out of the store. And he comes back and he's furious. And Roy Stryker says to Gordon Parks, shoot your anger. You know the image. He goes out and he shoots this portrait. He's in the office late at night. And this African-American cleaning woman is cleaning the offices, and he shoots her portrait in front of the blurred 48-star American flag, mop in one hand, broom in another, American Gothic. He brings us to Roy Stryker, and Roy Stryker says, are you trying to get us fired? That image is not shown publicly for a number of years after Gordon Parks shoots that image. But Gordon Parks, who becomes later the first African-American on the staff of Life magazine, becomes Gordon Parks because of the connection that the Rosenwald Fund made in placing him with Roy Stryker. So, as I started to say earlier, I'm going to close on a personal observation. I come to this work as a civic activist, and there's a component of this story which jumps out to me as I think about the power of this work and the power of this story. Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington are building schools for African-American children in the segregated South of 1912 America. That is a deeply optimistic act. That is a multi-generational act. And I find great power in this combination of optimism and long ball. And so, and indeed, this is actually the heart of Congressman Lewis's philosophy as well. He would say with great frequency, be hopeful, be optimistic. Our work is not the work of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the work of a lifetime. And so I'll close this portion of our evening with a refrain from these observations. Be optimistic, think long-term, and in the immortal words of John Lewis, make good trouble. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. We have a couple minutes for a couple of questions. So there's my microphone here, that microphone over there. Don't be shy. If you have a question, come on up. I was thinking there's a book that some folks might be interested. It's an exhibition catalog called A Force for Change, African-American Art and the Julius Rosenwald Fund. This was an exhibit that was created and hosted at the Spertus Institute of Jewish Studies in Chicago in 2008, 2009, where a young graduate student happened to be working at the front desk selling admission. And that was how I learned about the Rosenwald Fund. And so the arts chapter is a whole other chapter. Wonderful. That gave us some time to get a question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful talk tonight, and love the photographs. As a former photojournalist and soon to be documentary filmmaker, I'm wondering if you can compare the strength of the images and what you can use differently with still photographs compared to moving documentary film in portraying a message to the public, particularly in things like this. Thank you.
So the question's about still imagery versus moving imagery in documentary. I will add there is a wonderful documentary film called Rosenwald, made by Washington-based filmmaker Aviva Kempner. That film came out about a year after I started this project. I think we're living in this kind of golden age of documentary film. There's so many wonderful documentaries out there. We watch a lot of documentaries. It's a great way to tell stories. But as a photographer, I really do believe in the power of the still image. And you think about how still image has become part of our cultural language and our cultural memory. You think about the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. Everybody knows that photograph. You think about Dr. King's "I Have a Dream" speech. You know the photograph of his hand outstretched. And I think that one of the great photographs of all time is the photograph known as Earthrise, shot by the astronauts, in fact, specifically shot by astronaut Bill Anders when Apollo 8 went around the moon and came out back from the dark side of the moon and sees the Earth rising above the moon. That image unified humanity. And so I believe in the power of still images, but you have to find the image that contains emotional content and emotional connection that can communicate between the photographer and the viewer. And so this work was about finding the images that would help me communicate the richness and depth of this story. And that's what I try to do in my work.
So we have a question from online. Our friend, the photographer, Zed Saeed, asks, what motivated the white school boards to sign on to these projects? One would think that at the time and place that they would be against these schools.
So the question is, what motivated the white school boards to participate in the Rosenwald Schools program? So the short answer is it changes over time. In the beginning, there are some white progressives, and the fact that Julius Rosenwald was making a significant contribution, and in fact, in the early days of the program, most of the school systems made no contributions at all. Most of the money comes from the Black community. Remember, they are already being taxed to pay for white schools, but they had to raise the funds to match the Rosenwald, to provide the match for the Rosenwald grant. Most of the money comes from the Black community and from Julius Rosenwald. Over time, that changes. And the biggest reason that it changes is the Great Migration. The South is losing its workforce. And the white leadership understands that if they're going to maintain their workforce, they have to provide better educational opportunities for African-American children. By the end of the program, Julius Rosenwald has put up only 15% of the money. The vast majority of the money ultimately comes from 64% of the money came from white school systems. But that accelerant was created because of the imperative of the Great Migration.
Hi. So I'd like to go back for a second to the idea of photography and the use of the image. And I'm a former high school teacher, and I used to use photographs all the time. When I would, I'd have them analyze different photographs of, various things in American history. With the advent of AI and changing your photographs, and you see the commercial for the Google Pixel phone, and you can erase the things that you don't want in your picture. This terrifies me as a historian, because how do we take those primary sources that we assume are correct, and now they're no longer valid indications of what was actually there? So first of all, how worried should we be, and how as historians do we combat this problem?
So I think the question's both about the ubiquitousness, the ubiquity of photography, and also how new technologies can essentially make a photograph fake. As far as AI is concerned, the simple truth is this has come on relatively fast. Everybody understands that it's ethically challenged, and we're going to have to work through that as a culture. With the ubiquity of photography, everybody's a photographer. I think it has meant a couple of things for our society. One is that we are more apt at, or more proficient in processing visual imagery. That's a good thing. I think it raises the bar for photographers to imbue their work with additional emotional content and connectivity and storytelling, as opposed to, a lot of the images that get shot on phones are not about that. They serve a different purpose. But if I can then talk about some of the other things that you're talking about, back at the dawn of digital photography, when you can edit an image, there was a moment very much like we're in today with this dawn of AI. And I'll say certainly in the photography space, the watchword became simple: disclose. Disclose. If you're going to edit the image, you have an obligation to disclose. Early on, before we settled on that, National Geographic ran an image of a group of chimpanzees that were not actually, that image was a digital image that had been created with multiple images of chimpanzees. When they came up with the standard of disclose, they had to go back and apologize for not disclosing that image. So I think that I'm going to broaden that a little bit to say, I think that's a good way to think about it. And I think you have to be, number one, you have to be transparent. And number two, you have to be sensitive to the fact that there are ethical dilemmas in this work, and you have to consciously be prepared to make yourself aware of the ethical dilemmas and address the ethical dilemmas. I do not, somebody actually asked me, do you put the clouds in post-production? I don't do that. Not only do I not do that, frankly, if I wanted to, I don't have the skill to do that digitally. These images are as I shot them. I mean, I clean them up a little bit sometimes, but this is largely what I shot.
If there are no other questions, then let's maybe put our hands together for Andrew Feiler.